thank you very much, Professor David Bloc, for your time to talk about political economy, neoliberalism, and social class in applied linguistics. You're one of the leading social linguists of our time, with a significant contribution in social turn in SLA and identity and political economy in social linguistics and applied linguistics. I begin by asking you a very general question about your own academic journey as a social linguist or applied linguist.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. It's also one that recently for a series of reasons I won't go into, I've found myself in situations where giving a talk about the past, or I recently published a book on interviews and my experience with interviews, and I had to go back and sort of reconstruct my personal trajectory as a researcher. So I'm kind of ready to answer this question, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I had, just to be as brief as possible, I go back to my beginnings when I was an English language teacher here in Barcelona, and I did that for about 17 years. And it was really only, somewhat late. I finished my PhD when I was 40 years old, actually, in 1995. And that led me, into really wanting an academic career. And I was fortunate to get a job in London at the Institute of Education, University of London, which is now part of UCL, in 1996. So at that time, I would say my publications and my academic activity was more around English language teaching. I read a lot. I wasn't really a second language acquisition researcher, but I did read a lot about second language acquisition and published a few papers about the field and that sort of thing, very critical of it. I also, when my beginnings at the Institute of Education, I was teaching general courses on curriculum development and English language teaching. Everything was English language teaching, basically. But by the end of the century, and that sounds very grand, but it really was that way, I was already kind of grafting off what was around me, because when I moved to London, it was right in the middle of a lot of debates about multiculturalism and indeed multilingualism. And I felt like when I wrote about English language teaching, I was grafting off my experience in Barcelona as an English language teacher. Well, now I graft off my experience of, it could have been internal to my academic activity, but certainly what was going on around me in London. And so I started to read heavily. I already was reading a little bit from 96, 97 onwards. I started reading a lot in sociology on globalization, the big buzzwords of the time, globalization, multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And my research interests began to shift. And that's when I really started looking at identity, I would say, although I didn't really realize this until once we were around 2000, 2001 onwards. And the book, The Social Turn, which came out in 2003, was kind of my goodbye to second language acquisition. And I tried to take a more balanced view than perhaps some of my early publications on SLA were a bit strident. I tried to kind of have more balance to it and show my respect for the field, because I did have a great deal of respect for a lot of the research in the field, but certainly took a social view of the whole process and tried to basically it was an attempt to bring sociolinguistics into SLA, and in a way sociology, kind of in the background, and also anthropology. In any case, as we entered the century, I was already doing studies on identity. And that kind of carried me through. I would say that period went up into towards the end of the 2000s, so we get to 2007, and I published the book on second language identities. Then the economic crisis of 2007 and 2008 was a major turning point. And once again, with the idea of grafting off of what was around me, my reading shifted. I was already reading a lot in sociology and anthropology, and the sociology in particular was the sociology of globalization. And now I suddenly took an interest in political economy, a bit of work there was in applied linguistics. I'm thinking about Marnie Holborough, who took a more Marxist perspective. And by the time we get to 2009, Marnie Holborough, John Gray, and I, along with Pan Lin, who was a PhD student at that time, did a panel at BAL, and we did it on political economy. And this was the basis for the book that eventually came out in 2012, Neoliberalism and Applied Linguistics. So by the time we get to 2010, I'm already reading a lot in political economy and also Marxist political economy. And I can see a real gap in applied linguistics. So I go back and I can, find, very specific articles along the way by scholars
Yeah.
criticizing, saying we should be looking at political economy, but none of it ever coalesced into kind of a whole movement within the field. And there were people looking at class. Class was the other issue. And so it was like neoliberalism, inequality, class. These were the key constructs I began to focus on. And my publications shifted into that sort of full force. So it was almost like leaving identity behind and moving into social class. And then, of course, neoliberalism as the big framework, if you like. Um, and that's kind of carried on to this day, although, again, another shift has been over the past several years when I've really more fully gone into critical discourse analysis, even though I consider myself an amateur, but because I wasn't raised in that field. But, I've taken on, a kind of my own form of critical discourse analysis, looking at political discourses. And I'm currently writing a book about sort of the toxic information environment and the politics that, and of course, with things moving so fast with Trump's reelection, what's going on here in Europe, it's a moving, very rapidly moving object that I'm looking at, but looking at political discourse online in particular. So again, grafting off what's around me, if you like. But that, grosso modo, is kind of my career in a nutshell, I would say. And as I said, the political economy remains. It's always there now. And I was just recently, I've gone back and looked at books by David Harvey and Marx himself, and this sort of thing. So I'm always in there, looking at that sort of thing.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you very much for detailed response. As you mentioned that now the political economy is always the part of your scholarship, and you also mentioned that in one of your writings that political economy is a very broad church, and scholars are doing political economy differently. So if I ask, for example, what does actually political economy inspired analysis actually entail in applied linguistics?
Yeah. Well, I think my first contacts with political economy, on the one hand, coming out of the economic crisis, were basically Marxist in orientation. So you take a book by David Harvey's classic book from 2000, originally published in 2003, kind of history of neoliberalism, and then moving into all kinds of other scholars, Kalinikos and others, and Eagleton and all these people who've written about Marxism, if you like. But on the other hand, there is a political economy, and I'm not sure if this is what you're referring to, but in sociolinguistics around the work, particular key figure of Monica Heller, and this self-identifies as political economy oriented. And I would say it is. There is a political economy there, but it's not based in Marxism at all, if you like. And therefore, for me, I find it interesting. I do have publications where I cite very favorably this work. But when I started, sort of immersing myself in Marxism, which I must say is more an intellectual exercise in a way, because I'm not, I'm not beholden to anyone, if you like. I'm not going to say I'm only, reading one scholar and sort of venerate, a scholar from over 150 years ago and say, this is the be all and end all of thought, if you like. But I do find it as it helps me think as a kind of massive heuristic, it just helps me think about the world and makes sense. It points out to this day, there's a lot of things in Marxist theory that makes sense in terms of what's going on today, despite what some people might think. So the political economy of Monica Heller and other and Alexander Duchesne, like I would classify it as it's not Marxist in orientation, and I think they would accept that, and there's no reason why they should be. But obviously, it's produced extremely interesting work. And related to that is kind of the work on that's drawn more on Foucault. And of course, Foucault wrote the very, prescient material, the material he was coming out in around 1978 and 79. So just around the time of the rise of Thatcher and Reagan. And then earlier, of course, with Pinochet in Chile. These are the great early experiments of neoliberalism in the world. He talked about neoliberalism, Foucault actually used this term. But his critique is, again, distinctly not Marxist. At the time he was writing, Foucault in the latter part of his life had moved to positions that would probably be more like social democracy. He was certainly not extreme left. And indeed, there's a very interesting quote from Gary Becker, one of the paradigmatic Chicago boys, and his theories of human capital are quite famous in the literature that is behind, neoliberal economic theory. He said he'd read Foucault's work because Foucault refers massively to Becker in his work from the 70s on neoliberalism, and Becker said, "Well, I can't, I find it interesting what he says, and I can't really tell if he's being critical of my work or he's in favor of it." And I think that says quite a lot the way Foucault was writing. So this is not to discredit Foucault in any way, but I think to take Foucault as an extreme left scholar would be a mistake. On the other hand, what he does have to say about discourse, I've found very, very interesting. And I think his archaeologies, where you can take a field or an institution like medicine or psychiatry or something, and go back and reconstruct how elements in the field, including human beings, are discursively constructed. And so I think I can still draw on that sort of framework. But I think the whole thing of governability and that sort of thing. So a lot of people took neoliberalism into the realm and political economy into the realm of Foucault's view, which is more the social side, if you like, is how people are organized into institutions and how they are conditioned indeed by institutions as discursively constructed, if you like. And that work is fine. And again, I have also been in that as well, if you like. But I think the kind of Marxist end is really kind of sticking hardcore to social class in particular as a central construct, and being critical of most of the work that goes on in sociolinguistics or applied linguistics more broadly, which is more around what Nancy Fraser would call, issues of recognition, so sort of key identity dimensions and the oppressions associated with them, such as race, racism, gender, sexism, LGBTQ plus, and any number of phobias around that, or religious identity, any kind of oppressive structure which is related to some aspect of what is clearly identity, if you like. But leaving, to a great extent, class out of the equation. And this is where my criticism of a lot of work comes in.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now this is,
Yeah.
I think, very interesting theoretical question, because as a doctoral researcher, I myself faced difficulty. I'm doing critical discourse analysis, and where I draw on Marxist-based CDA and also using this post-structural work of Foucault. So I was actually
Yeah.
deciding on what is my ontology and what is my epistemology, because I was switching between two different
Yeah.
paradigms. And your own journey has been very interesting, switching from
Yeah.
post-structuralism to
Yeah.
the economy. So I was wondering, is it like possible to synthesize different perspectives into academic work, or if we are bringing different perspectives together, that it poses kind of complications in understanding of the problems?
Yeah. Well, I think an answer to that might be, and I just recently finished a chapter for a book which is on critical realism and
Mhm.
applied linguistics, and that's being edited by Jeremy Bouchard and Karen Zaltzman, and that's brought me back into really looking at my view of critical realism. But if you look at my publications over the last 15 years, I inevitably have a little section where I put in something on critical realism, and I just repeat myself most of the time on that. But critical realism, I first came in contact with it when I started reading philosophy of science, and that was kind of an era, I think, that having a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, perhaps, because I was reading Feyerabend, I was reading. And I was really getting into the whole kind of defining myself as a post-structuralist. So we're talking here about the period like 1993, 1994. I was working on my PhD at that time, in fact. Um, and um, and I wrote the article in 1996 in Applied Linguistics, which is a critique of SLA, a kind of wild, kind of relativistic view of the world, which I would write in a very different way today. But that caused a lot of kind of furore, I think, in among a lot of mainstream SLA researchers, and perhaps rightly so. I mean, looking back, I mean, that's I can look at it from a different perspective now.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think I was kind of thinking in terms I was a post-structuralist, and at that time I read Bhaskar, Roy Bhaskar, the sort of founder of critical realism, at that time, but it didn't really register with me. And then later there was a very interesting article by David Corson in Applied Linguistics where he talked about critical realism. And then later there was Alison Seeley and Bob Carter wrote a book in 2004, I think it was published. But also Alison Seeley's been somebody who fairly constantly within Applied Linguistics has written about critical realism. But that was all kind of on the back burner. But when I had this kind of epiphany, so to speak, moving to political economy, going back about now it's been over 15 years ago. I realized that if I never have said I'm a Marxist, but if I am kind of running with the Marxists, so to speak, reading a lot of Marxists and kind of taking on a lot of their ideas, if I'm putting myself in that kind of general field, I think Marxists are, by default, they are critical realists, because one of the key elements of critical realism is, which distinguishes it from a lot of post-structuralist work, if not all, is the belief that there are realities, there are real structures and causal mechanisms that exist beyond our ability to grasp them, to understand them, to even talk about them or write about them. That's the fundamental thing. It's the realism coming in. But this is not positivism, because then you have beyond that, you have a realm, what actually happens, what's caused, which is the actual realm, and then the empirical realm, which is what we actually grasp on the surface and maybe talk about in our research. And the problem with positivism is it works at the actual level of the phenomena taking place and establishes cause and effect relationships. So it's a funny kind of realism. And it also doesn't take into account a lot of other things going on the surface of scientific practice, which is discursively constructed, and which post-structuralism actually has a lot to offer. So the kind of genius in Bhaskara's approach, and this is his early work from the 70s, because he evolved over time. He died in 2014, I think. But he evolved over time, and he became very, very much enthralled with spirituality and religion at the end of his life and how to insert it into the framework. And he developed new structural understandings, if you like. But I find his early work actually the most useful, if you like. So this early work, so he at the level of sort of epistemology, if you like. So the ontology is real, but the epistemological level, he then brings in a much more, what looks more like a post-structuralist approach, and indeed a degree of plurality and relativism, recognizing that there will be different points of view, and et cetera, et cetera. But then he brings in the element of what we do judgmentally, and judgmental relativism is rejected outright. So it's not a question of saying, oh, everybody has a right to, everybody has their theory, and there are all these different theories, and let 1,000 flowers bloom and all that, and I can't possibly tell you one theory is better than the other. And this is where he steps in and says, no, we do have reasons to, at a given time in history, accept one theory as the best one, if you like, right?
Yeah.
And so I really sort of coming down to earth started seeing that, yes, okay, because otherwise it's almost dishonest, I think. And I think if you look at the way people write who are post-structuralists, myself included, we are saying we think what we're saying is worth reading. We're saying that we think we have the best theory. Why would we not think otherwise? Why would we write what we're writing if we didn't think it was the best, route to get to saying interesting things or whatever we think we're doing? So I think in a way that judgmental relativism does become very, very difficult. But we get to philosophical arguments. It's self-contradictory and all this sort of thing. But there are but beyond that, there's just sort of the practicality of what we actually do as researchers. And when we start putting our ideas out there, we are saying, this is based on everything I've done. This is what I think, and I think it's the best. I think it's the best possible theory I can come up with right now. So that's what we're doing, really. We're not being relativists. We're saying we think one theory is better than the other. Be interesting if anybody listens to this and there's any blowback on that, but I'm sure somebody could contest that and maybe win an argument with me. I don't know, but I have come to that conclusion. So you have the ontology being real, you have the epistemology, which does allow a more issues around discursively constructed knowledge and that sort of thing coming in, competing theories. And then you get into the whole judgmental side, in which case you do say, yes, at any given moment in time, I'm thinking this is the best theory, right? So I think that's very simple way of putting it, and I am oversimplifying things, no doubt. But it's interesting reflection, and I think I mean one of the points of this book coming out, and I think I also say this in my chapter, is that what's the point of this sort of reflection on what you're doing? Because my chapter is a kind of self-reflection on
Mm.
my own trajectory.
Yeah.
Is well, it it helps you think. I mean, it helps you understand what you're doing, and it might lead you out of potential contradictions in your research and the way you're writing about your research and that sort of thing. So I think it is useful to reflect on the philosophy of science behind what we're doing. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, that wasn't really your question at the beginning,
Yeah,
but we
yeah,
have kind of
that's very helpful. Yeah.
yeah, that direction. Yeah.
And your work on neoliberalism and applied linguistics with Professor John Gray and Manny Albro has been very helpful to many scholars globally. I myself got inspiration from your work to look into how neoliberalism is actually shaping Pakistani ELT landscape. So, for example, I looked
Yeah.
into how supranational organizations are working in Pakistan, like USAID, British Council, and then the UK aid, and how they are actually trying to create what you call the neoliberal citizen. So,
Yeah.
how do you comment on this, and how can we actually counter these kind of neoliberal regimes of truth actually in global South countries
Yeah.
particularly?
Yeah. Well, I think the neoliberal citizen and that whole concept and writing about that is, of course, drawing on the work of a lot of people, neoliberal subjectivity, and of course you have people like Wendy Brown, and Wendy Brown's drawing on earlier work by Foucault, and in sociolinguistics, people like Joseph Park have written extensively about this sort of thing, and looking at the context of South Korea in his case, and it's it's interesting to see how, and again, this I kind of go back to a more Marxist approach, kind of sort of shifts in the economy generate new forms of the social, political, and everything else. This is not to say that nothing in the social, political culture can exist. I'm not saying nothing there can exist independently of economics. It can, it's a very complicated mix between kind of economic and everything else. But no doubt, neoliberalism as a set of economic policies and practices, as an ideology, as a rationality, as Dardot and Laval would put it, and as an ethic, I think David Harvey talks about. Whatever we want to call it, it morphs, from the economic into ways of being in the world, and this is where the neoliberal citizenship comes in. And it's quite remarkable the same way that the economic shifts have taken place. And obviously, we do have to always talk about neoliberalism as variegated in the sense that it's different in every context, because every context that is identified as having a kind of neoliberalized economy, which is pretty much the whole world by now, the substrata, what's undergirds that historically in particular, and in the moment, if you like, when these policies start coming in, is going to be very different. And you need only look at China. I mean, China is absolutely fascinating example of what still identifies itself as a communist regime, but by now, um, what is it, economically? And I'm not I don't have the vocabulary of economic terms to take that on, but obviously there are a lot of people who are taking that on in their work. And I always think it's kind of interesting, when people say, communism is bad, communism doesn't work and everything. Well, if they accept that China is actually becoming the number one economy in the world, then they're saying that communism is a better economic system if they stick to the idea that China truly is a communist country. So anyway, that's just an aside. So with regard to specific context, so if we take a look we could look at South Asia in general. We look at Pakistan, for example. Um, I don't. I've read a little bit, about what's going on economically, but I think that there's elements of economic policies that have been adopted in a state that would have been considered not the same capitalist state as you would find in, say, Western Europe, for example, from the beginning. So there's that going on, and how that filters in to new ways of being. I think in countries around the world, there have been commentary about a new subject who's emerged, which is the new rich person, you know. So this is in China or certainly in Russia, post-communist Russia. You suddenly had these, what people talk about the oligarchs or something, but you suddenly had people excessively rich. And I think all over the world we're seeing this figure. So I have no doubt that that's emerged as well. And it could be a person who's like a global citizen who's very well connected, perhaps with the UK and other countries in the world and that sort of thing. Um, and that could be seen as emerging from this economic, you know, these economic changes moving up, presenting, affording the emergence of these new figures in society. Um, but on the other hand, there's a crossing, you know, what was already there, you know, if you like. And so, you know, all of the kind of exploitative systems that could have existed before neoliberal policy started being brought in, they're still there. They're still there residually, if you like, you know, sort of draw on the terminology of Raymond Williams, and they float to the surface there's a confluence, you know, of what's the new, whatever's the new, you know, that's arising through the adoption of policy. I'm not sure that's making sense, but anyway, so all of this comes together. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if anywhere in the world somebody told me there's this kind of new figure of this neoliberal citizen, but certainly the winners in all of this, you know, the people are sort of high flyers and they might have a flashy car and, you know, they've just taken on all the accoutrements of what success means in capitalism and that sort of thing. Now, in the education system, which I think you might be interested in, I mean, this becomes interesting as what kind of shifts have there been in if we think of educational systems as the institutions through which people are socialized. They're not the only institutions through which people are socialized, but they are, in some cases, could be seen as the primary ones because of the fact that children from an early age spend a big part of their day in school. And everything, you know, like in societies where the weekend's important, all of this is conditioned. It's like having a parallel to the work week. You know, you're in school, if you like. So interesting to look at the shifts in educational policy. You know, is there a new vocabulary being used in official documents? So if there's an educational reform where the official education policy is rewritten, is it being rewritten with the insertion of keywords such as innovation, you know, entrepreneurial skills, and that sort of thing? And again, and I find it what I find this is a fine line perhaps, but it'd be interesting to see how much of these things are just a calque. You know, it's like somebody takes a policy from another part of the world and just brings it in and reworks it, or they emerge naturally from the fact we've adopted these economic policies and we've established that the country should be going in this direction economically. Therefore, the education system needs to be reformed in this direction, and that's where the vocabulary comes from. You know, probably both, in fact. But you know, it'd be interesting to see that. You know, sort of where this comes from, if you like. But the end result is in countries poor and rich, emerging economies, already established economies, economies in decay, whatever, all over the world, we seem to have these these kind of discourses, if you like, of society floating around, which have emerged on the back of the neoliberal turn in economy worldwide. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you very much. So in your scholarship, social class appears to be an interesting theoretical and analytical category. And your understanding of social class is different from like the traditional understanding of social class as upper, middle, and lower class. So how do you elaborate this particular concept, and how can it help actually to researchers and applied linguists to engage with this concept?
Yeah, well, I don't reject the kind of, you know, upper, middle, and whatever. And of course, there have been lots of variations on that. There's a fairly recent European project, and I've forgotten the exact reference now. It's somewhere, but a lot of these models draw on a combination of sources, and Bourdieu's views come in, if you like. Bourdieu is obviously a key figure, but Bourdieu is really drawing a great deal on Max Weber and a little bit of Marx. So Sorry, I forgot. What was the question again? Sorry, I just
Yeah,
snapped.
I mean, how could
So,
we actually start
yeah,
engaging with this concept, actually, the researchers in applied linguistics?
yeah. Um, no, there was something I was going to say and I forgot. Sorry, I've just gone. Oh yeah, the upper mid. Yeah, sorry. Let's go back. Let's start here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So with regard to the upper middle, et cetera. So I don't. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I meant to say that. So I don't really disagree with that completely. And in fact, that I mean, there was one thing that was, there was a lot of literature coming out around 2010, which was looking at the Great Recession that began in 2007 and 8, and Gérard Duménil and Dominique Lévy, two French Marxist economists at that time and since have published quite a lot on the sort of what is neoliberalism and how it's manifested itself. And one of the things they had is a very simple model of the sort of 1%, 9%, and 90%.
Yeah.
And this captures a general idea that we can talk about class in those terms,
Mm.
statistically even. And the 90%, what that captures is the way a lot of what was traditionally middle class has been pushed down. So it might be that their work conditions have become more precarious, or in relative terms, at least relative to the top end, their salaries have gone down. And indeed, the people at the very bottom end, of course, their salaries have gone further. So there's been a salary, but there was a there, if you like. And how this managerial class has been kind of reconfigured and gone with the 1% at the top. So where the big, where big capital is, the billionaires and all that, this class has become more aligned with that as far as what their interests are and where they see themselves, if you like. And just a kind of anecdotal thing, I started noticing visiting the US over the 1980s and 90s was how people in society, they just seem to have that much more purchasing power. So it's sort of projected upward even further. And instead of having 4-bedroom houses, they had 6-bedroom houses, and they always had a swimming pool. And maybe the swimming pool was bigger than it would have been before. And their, as they say, front yard and backyard and all that would have been bigger. So that's kind of that's anecdotal, that's observation. Analysts is kind of the movers and shakers of the world economy, people who live more cosmopolitan existence and have less invested in the actual country they live in. So this new global citizen class. And he was writing about that in the 1991 book that he published. So very prescient, really, because this is what has actually occurred in a way, and is the source of a great deal of political conflict in countries like the US. A lot of what Trump's success is down to an attack, this elite, if you like. So anyway, so all these systems that exist, and now they come down to like 10 categories, ending with the very bottom of the economic scale of people who are actually the outcasts of society, who are not even in employment and sort of just outside the economy. And at the top, looking at Elon Musk and, people like that. So a lot of these guys, I actually find this useful. And so I think there is something that can be used there. And I've never completely, said this is useless, but what I have tried to do is develop a model, somewhat pretentiously called the constellation of dimensions, but trying to capture how class is a moving object and a very big one. And E.P. Thompson's early views of, he was a Marxist, but looking at cultural elements. The same with Raymond Williams. So taking on board that work, taking on board Bourdieu, but then going back to basics with Marx. And so really still thinking that there's a base to class, which is about where the person is situated with regard to the means of production. Now people say, what on earth is the means of production in a global economy dominated by the internet? Well, there's still, there's a way of adapting what we understand employment to be about. People still have jobs, and they still work for people. So, for example, the recent example that's come up of the engineers hired through the special visa program in the United States by the Zuckerbergs and Bezos and Musk of the world in the out of the Silicon Valley in the old technosphere. And I think a very, very high percentage of these people are from India. So these are people who are highly qualified technically, but perhaps in India would not receive in global terms, a very high salary. and they're brought in on a special visa and paid a salary that might look on the surface like much better than what they would get in India, but it's certainly below what a U.S. citizen would accept, a U.S. citizen with that technological know-how would accept. And so this creates kind of a cleavage, if you like, you know. And there you have exploitation, a key concept in Marx coming in.
Mm.
And again, they're working for a company, getting a wage. And of course, the surplus labor power, the idea, you know, what you're producing is beyond. What you're producing, again, is more intangible, if you like. It's not an automobile, it's not that, but it's still, you are producing. And you know, so you're shifting whatever. You might have projects to work on, but you have to finish them and that sort of thing, or you're writing program or whatever. So there are, you know, there in some cases the products are tangible, and you're basically underpaid within the U.S. Job market for people working in that sector. So then this concept of exploitation come into play here, and how you're situated in a capitalist economy. And eventually alienation, another key concept, could come in if these workers, you know, become, you know, sort of start seeing themselves as exploited, if you like, and start seeing themselves as sort of separated from the work they're doing, or not fully invested in it. But whatever the case, you know, I think there's a key here. So I keep Marx there, but you know, all these other influences come in. So there are other things, we might even call them effects of class, you know, that are associated with class. And you know, I got my little list here. I did prepare this. Yeah, I did prepare this much, but you know, so you know, it's the basic material stuff we think about, which might be linked to the type of work you do. And again, as I said, your position in terms of production processes. But then there are all these other things that Bourdieu and others identified. So there's, you know, like I have a place of residence, you know, so the type of neighborhood you live in defines you in class terms. People think about middle class neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, and indeed the type of dwelling you live in. And concepts like gentrification, again, are about shifts that take place in neighborhoods that might formerly be working class or poor, and then suddenly become more middle class. And education, obviously, is a key. Social networking, who are the people you hang out with? And I think there's a degree of dishonesty among some people in some cases here, because they really think about the people they hang out with as people like themselves. So, you know, this is normal through job, the type of job you have, you meet people. And there's a long literature, a very, very interesting literature, body of literature in Britain about the working class boy, usually it's a male figure, who you know, grows up in a mining community in the 1950s and then or 60s and then goes to university. So man, you know, one of the few people in the community who gets to university and then is educated, goes into professions, and this kind of, you know, sort of divided loyalties kind of thing. And again, going back to the village and finding that you just don't fit in, and you find your mates from when you were up to the age of 11 who you kind of left behind through the schooling system. And so this you know, creates a kind of, you know, all kinds of internal conflicts, if you like, in a person. But definitely the whole thing about education and social networking is important. Consumption patterns, you know, various forms of symbolic behavior, which could come out in the way people dress and the way they move and everything else. Spatial relations, you know, how much space do we have around us? Like in a, you know, in a home with 5 kids and 3 bedrooms, you know, you have people doubling up, you know, sleeping, or in a more middle class home, every child has a bedroom, you know, that type of thing. And that conditions people. All of these things become important in conditioning who we are. And mobility has become a key issue as well. You know, who is mobile? In what way are they mobile?
Yeah.
And we're living in times of hypermobility where we're seeing an oversaturation of tourism and that sort of thing. But obviously within that tourism, there are different types of tourists and different ways of traveling. And life chances, you know, basically the quality of life that we have are kind of, and of course, cutting across all this is the whole notion of inequality, you know.
Mm.
So you know, the kind of, if you take an individual and start defining them in terms of all those categories, um, their profile, if you like, is going to be very different from another person. You know, if a middle class person is going to be different from a working class person. And then you would find kind of crossovers. So for example, the idea that somebody working as you know, somebody who has a low level of education, might previously have been the type of person to go into working in a factory, but becomes a decorator, so like painting houses and, doing various work on houses in a country like the UK. And I did observe this, this was going on from the 1990s onwards, in particular in the UK. So you had people who became quite wealthy. So you have this kind of idea of somebody who's wealthier than middle class people, therefore is kind of middle class in terms of wealth. But in terms of background and education and all of the things around, what Bourdieu called distinctions, so what I mentioned earlier, symbolic behavior and consumption patterns, is still very working class. And so you have, I think a model like this allows you to kind of comment on these kind of clear profiles and less clear profiles, if you like. And by the way, just another anecdote. I mean, one time I was working with somebody, the project kind of was aborted, but it had to do with the number of British people from the 90s onwards who started moving abroad for a lifestyle migration, if you like. And so this person was looking at a village in France, in the southwest of France, and how suddenly a lot of people from Britain had moved into the village, a lot being a handful, but in a small village, that's a big influence. And this was happening across, particularly the whole south of France. And so in this group, all of the people were very middle class and upper middle class and very well educated, and many of them spoke French already. And there was one exception, was a family who'd made their fortune in construction and decorating and that sort of thing. And so they had the same amount of money, but they didn't speak French. They didn't have, anything. And they were kind of somewhat isolated, because they didn't, the type of people they would hang out with, the whole social networking thing had changed. And they thrust themselves into this environment where the other Brits there, so to speak, were very different Brits, from the ones that they would spend time with in the UK. These, it makes sense to me to see class in more Marxist terms, and inserted into a capitalist system of exploitation of labor, or even expropriation of surplus labor. Ultimately, the alienation that comes with that, prioritizing exchange value over use value, the market, really being devoted to the market as the be all and end all of how we define ourselves. All these things that come with capitalism today, call it neoliberalism, call it what you want. Your insertion into that is a very fundamental part of that's what class is about. But all these other things I mentioned are also in the mix. And so when we define somebody in class terms, we focus on some element of one of those, of these different things that I've mentioned, or one or more elements, I should say.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is very, very interesting and very helpful. Moving towards another question, I recently read one of your articles with Bori on academic capitalism, and where you actually talk about various interesting terms like toxic university, dark academia, metrification, and even the term of superstar academics. And especially you have talked about in a particular European context.
What was that? So I didn't.
Yeah, like
I didn't catch the final term.
The superstar academics. Superstar academics.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay, right. Okay, got it. Yeah, okay.
So I was thinking that you have acknowledged this in the European context, but if I see in the global South country like Pakistan, the situation is even worse, where the universities and the university professors, they are under the heavy influence of the neoliberalism, and they are even ready to pay for the publications to enhance their CVs and enrich their profiles. So how do you compare?
All right. Well, I think there are two things. I mean, one is the kind of the sort of celebrity academic, or the high flyer, and that's related to what Frank calls the attention economy, and he writes specifically about academics. The people go, for you're out there for the adulation. It does create a kind of interesting. You're orienting to recognition as what's driving you more than sort of it being a lucrative field, So there could be money that comes with being a celebrity academic. And it probably does if you popularize, if you write popularized books and they sell it and you go on television and that sort of thing. But more than that is the attention, is what the buzz, that's the buzz. That's what's the payoff is. So I think that's one issue. The other thing is how the sort of insidious the influences of neoliberalism and infiltrating into academia leads to practices that are more typical of which are endemic to capitalism. You know, in a way, that's what you do. You cheat basically to get ahead. It reminds me of when Britain started going wholesale to letting private companies run schools, charter schools, whatever they're called, you know. And I think that's still going. I'm sure that's still going on. But there was a book. This had been piloted in the United States, not surprisingly, in the 1990s. And there was a book called "Giving the Kids the Business" by, oh God, I forgot his name. The surname starts with an M, and now I've totally forgotten it. But anyway, and it was fascinating to read because he documents in the book how you had companies running schools and they were falling behind the goals they'd set for themselves, and they were going to be evaluated. So they started cheating. And one way they cheated was actually falsifying performance of students. So they could, they inflated the exam results of students to sell that before and after, once we came and took over this school, the academic performance. So that kind of cheating is kind of, that's what you do in a capitalist system. You don't just cheat, but you do anything you can to win. That's what makes Donald Trump so interesting in a way, but that's maybe another issue. But in the context of, say, in Pakistan, you have people, and this is not the only place in the world this will be going on, people paying, other people to. Well, see, the thing is, now we have the technology again would come in. We haven't really talked much about technology, but how important technology is. And of course, with all the artificial intelligence and the chat GPT boom from 2 years ago, and now we've moved on, and there's just so much, this is going to get more and more sophisticated as the new tool that academics can use to produce academic products that you don't really need. Again, paying somebody might become, something from the past. Plagiarism becomes a thing of the past. A lot of, this eliminates the necessity of a lot of practices or, sort of, the kinds of things you're not supposed to be doing. I was going to say illegal. They're not, strictly speaking, illegal in some cases, but whatever the case, and so that's another issue, this artificial intelligence. But I'm not surprised that any way to get ahead is going to come into it once you start setting goals, accountability measures. Accountability in itself is it's not a bad thing to hold people accountable in academia. And I thought that when I first started working in the UK in 1996, and that was when there was a big boom in accountability in higher education. I didn't think everything they were doing, to be honest, was bad. I thought it was an idea to get people out there to publish, to do research is not a bad thing. The bad thing comes in when you overly quantify these things and the systems themselves take over. And it becomes very much kind of bean counting, as they say, and people are just, the system becomes the be all end all, and you kind of forget what it was created for, if you like. So anything that was good about it, it's kind of is lost. And I think all of these things together, all these different measures that are now taken in higher education, the pressure exerted on young academics coming in. I hate to say this, but it's like, it's easy for me to say. I've recently retired, and I think I was able to live a little bit of the golden era of academia, and I think that worldwide we're seeing a worsening of conditions. It's amazing the similarities in what's happening in academia. And of course, maybe not surprising given the way that communications are so immediate nowadays, that you can have an idea about organizing a university and immediately everywhere in the world, people can have access to that idea. But certainly, these practices, anything that people do to get ahead is part of, once you start changing the nature of academia and you forget all the noble notions of, creating knowledge and sharing ideas and all that. And it just becomes a competition to the top to be a better global university than the other global university. And internationalization is the key. They're everywhere. All universities now call themselves international universities. And so you're just in this competition. So whatever it might take, I'm not surprised by it, but it's pretty appalling, but it is what it is. It is what's going on. The key issue is what you do about it, but that's that's difficult. Yeah. Also, sorry, I was just going to say, going back to what I said earlier about the neoliberal citizen, I have been quite shocked on occasions, although I shouldn't be, given what I just said, at how individual academics, people I might meet and I've met over the years, to me embody all of these characteristics of the neoliberal citizen, the entrepreneurial side, just the way they operate and even the way they treat people in some cases, and certainly the way they treat what they're doing. And yet, some of these people are denouncing neoliberalism in their work, and that seems to me a bit, or oppression in general, or any number of things. And yet, the way they're operating to me betrays a kind of an alignment with this way of functioning. That's, that, it. I was obviously not going to mention any names, but I mean, I have come across people where that's what I was observing going on, if you like. Right? So,
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether you have worked on this particular idea, but I wanted your comments on it. For example, the field of applied linguistics and social linguistics is actually heavily influenced by Eurocentrism or the Anglo-centrism, actually, because I'm coming from the global South countries where we only learn about these European thinkers and American or the British thinkers. So how do you come in? Like, how can we think the field of applied linguistics through South and North engagements?
yeah. Yeah, I've been criticized actually a couple of things. Like when I was writing about political economy, there was one review of a book that said I didn't even mention postcolonialism or anything. But my familiarity with postcolonialism, a lot of it goes through authors like Frantz Fanon, and who I have read, and others. But I'm not, and I am interested in particularly those, there are always Marxist strands in what used to be called post-colonialism. Now today we might call it decolonial literature, or, there could be other terms being used, but there's always been a Marxist strand in there, and there's certainly a political economy of post or decolonialism. So it is one of these things I have on my to-do list to really go beyond the reading I've done, which I think is limited to a great extent. But the notion of ideas, as being linked to being Eurocentric, or scholars being Eurocentric. I think I'm a Eurocentric scholar in the sense that I really at one level, I can't be anything else because I grew up in a European dominant culture in the US, and
Yeah.
I left at the age of 22, but I ended up in Spain and also lived in Britain. So Europe, if you like. So
Mm.
I'm just immersed in this all my life, if you like, and so the only thing you can do in that situation, this is what scholars like Alistair Pennycook have done, for example, is to read, is to could be to live in different parts of the world, and also to live the life, and also to read and read and read and inform yourself. And but I'm not sure that that leads you necessarily to getting outside of that, you know, because it leads something that's more of an evolved form of your thinking, but that will always it is based in a Eurocentric view. Yeah, I'm not sure that makes sense, but
Mm.
I'm not sure you can get outside yourself, right? That's not a reason to do nothing, but you do. I think it needs to be recognized, I think.
Mm.
So you're just taking on more and more ideas, basically, and so they become part of you, and they filter back in to what was there before. It's just the way cognition works, if you like. There's something there that interacts with the outside world and the thinking, and you synthesize. You're synthesizing new forms of thinking. As for people who've grown up in countries like Pakistan, Obviously, the European presence has been there. Obviously, if we're talking about, ex-colonial environments.
Yeah.
How much of that is, Edward Said is an interesting figure because he is, for me, he's so saturated in, if you like, Eurocentric, Enlightenment traditions and everything else,
Mm.
and yet he's a critic of certainly of the politics in the world that has emerged from Eurocentric societies, and obviously, the whole concept of Orientalism and everything else coming out of that. But, you start reading, not even between the lines, you start reading carefully a lot of his stuff. He's very, the canon, so the canon of great English language literature, for example, he is, in a way, a product of that, in a dare I say, he would have been seen as kind of a believer in that, or at least it was something that was familiar to him. It was something that was a part of him. I should say that that's probably captured it better. That canon has put a part of his very being as an intellectual, if you like. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it's very complicated to. I think it's a mistake to talk about the North and the South and the Eurocentric and non, the other, whatever that is, in very stark terms. It's a mistake. I think it's not a mistake to talk about it, but it's a mistake to position things so much along those lines. So
Mm.
while it might be fair to look at what I've written and say, David, you're just completely in the Euro kind of world, I would have to accept that, and I think that's what I'm doing. Do I need to do better? Do I need to step outside that? Well, probably, yeah, and that is something I can do, but I don't think I'm totally oblivious to, and I don't think it means that I can't comment, and I think this goes back to a lot of criticisms of Marx. They go back, the fact it's so long ago that he wrote about what he was writing. He was writing very specifically. I was looking at something with David Harvey recently, and David Harvey would say that he really was only writing about industrialization in Manchester, even. You could even go back that far. Forget Eurocentric. He was Manchester centric vis-a-vis, Birmingham centric or London centric, So again, but the ideas there, because I've been speaking the whole time up to now about the spread of ideas, neoliberalism. So while you recognize variegation of various forms of being around the world related to neoliberalism, you still kind of say there is, dare I say, almost like universal. These things are happening. And with regard to the Enlightenment, that you say, well, we must reject the grand narratives of the Enlightenment and everything. But is that possible in some cases? And is it, given the spread of those ideas historically, and they've been around for centuries? And the other thing is whether it's advisable to reject everything to do with the Enlightenment, because while the Enlightenment, yes, can be linked to slavery, for example, it also can be linked to very clear ideas about free thinking and a lot of the basis of what we're doing. And I'm just trying to be honest about these. I think that there's an honesty required to say, look, that a lot of this stuff is not yes or no, or we have to complete it. And in fact, a lot of people writing are embodying, and this is an easy thing to say, and I know it's a typical argument and everything, but they embody a lot of the Eurocentric or European culture, historical European culture is a part of the way that things are taking place. Now, that could be because the dominant forms in academia, as imposed, force people to do that, and that's no doubt true. Uh, but whether or not every single idea related to that, and I'm not sure anybody really says this, but they say, look, I have to ignore everything and I have to find something that's more, if you like, indigenous to where I am and
Mm.
reject everything else that comes from Europe. I don't think anybody's saying that, but if you did take that view of saying that's there, I'm here, then I'm not sure that would be the best way to go, and it might impoverish thinking. But there's certainly a lot of space for thinking about um, uh, you know different ways of viewing the world, very obviously on just a very basic level. And this comes, Marx. One of the big things about Marx a lot of people don't look at is the historically situated nature of whatever the reality is we're looking at.
Mm.
And that is a very powerful concept because, I mean, he applies that to capitalism, when he talks about how through ideology, capitalism is presented as natural. So the neoliberalism today is presented as there is no alternative. It is the natural form that human beings have evolved to, and that's just the way it is, and you should just accept it. No, everything we do, all economic forms, all forms are historically situated. Therefore, again, if we were going to be honest about, we want to be honest and move forward in a sort of complete way of understanding reality, then we have to take into account in ex-colonial context what is there that's been pushed down and not allowed onto the world stage, if you like. But I don't know exactly when I've read about Southern epistemologies and various things. I sometimes perhaps haven't read enough about this, and like I said, I think this is something I can work on, and I have more time now. I can read all kinds of things. I do have a reading list of things that do are related to decolonial literature, but
Yeah.
I need to I can get into that. But I'm not sure when I read these things, what I have read up to now, that I don't see anything in there that's objectionable. It's I can't think that way. I can't see that. So yes, the dialogue should continue,
Mm.
and we'll see what happens. But I don't know if would there be a time when we could look at applied linguistics and say let's freeze frame applied linguistics now and go back 50 years ago and just say we're thinking in a totally different way, kind of thing. I don't know. It could happen, but I just don't really have an answer to the question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really wonderful to listen to you, and you have actually given wonderful and very detailed responses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.